Police officers of Reddit. Who was the smartest criminal you've ever encountered? Story 1. I am not a law enforcement officer, but there are some memorable retail ones. Best Buy got robbed by people cutting through the ceiling and dropping down from there, lifting electronics out of the roof like Mission Impossible. No one got caught. Another one from Best Buy, a customer service counter worker, where they do returns, waits till any big box item reaches the maximum date of a price adjustment. The price adjusts the item, refunding the difference as cash and leaving it in the register. They had to memorize which transactions and correlate the sales flyers and the numbers and SKUs, stock keeping units. Loss prevention couldn't figure out how the worker was getting the cash out of the register through, because there were no cameras that captured them ever getting it out of the register. See if you can guess how. I have my ideas. Music retail chain would take deposits on upcoming releases and then would call you when it'd arrive and hold it for you under your name. The thing is that even when you'd call and talk to the people, they may never come in for the item. So a store manager gets the brilliant idea to come in early to work and use the deposits to buy gift cards for themselves. POS, or point-of-sale systems, were so awful at the time that using gift certificate deposits to buy a single gift certificate didn't flag the system. The district manager is supposed to come in and audit out receipts, but he never did hers, assuming because she was a favorite. One day, an assistant manager showed up 5 minutes early to work and saw that there were some sort of transactions on the receipt roll of a register, but the store wasn't opened yet. Waits till the manager leaves for the day and pulls the receipt roll. This one is from music retail chain, but from a different location. A full-time employee and a union member working at the location for upwards of 15 years. He was very antisocial and bad at customer service, so they used him for all truck operations, opening deliveries, and setting things up to be stocked by other employees. This guy was awful to everyone, but he always volunteered to take out all the store's garbage, which is a job that anyone could do. I get suspicious and get the opportunity to follow him out by another entrance while he takes out the garbage one time. I see him head to the dumpster and then remove 3 giant industrial black garbage bags out of the trash. We're talking about 2.5 times the largest leaf bags for lawns. I wait till he gets to his car, then yell his name. "Yo, Candy, bring me those bags." He starts stuttering. "Snake, it's not what you think." I opened the first bag and it was completely full of the hottest and latest DVDs, CDs, and video games. This dude has been robbing the store blind for years. I suspended him on the spot and told him loss prevention will contact him. Typically, the thief doesn't respond to loss prevention attempts to contact, and after 3 days, you fire them for job abandonment. But the same district manager who missed the thief manager's deposit scam from before gets a hard-on to get this guy. The guy finally scheduled a loss prevention interview 3 weeks later. Candy brought a lawyer and said, "I didn't do anything, it's the manager's word against mine." They brought him back and paid him back pay for the time suspended. Candy begins calling cops prevention daily to complain I'm a thief. I made sure that he has to personally help every customer on earth that walks in, which ends up finally driving him to quit. Another one from music retail chain. A worker I refused to hire who was related to another manager was hired while I ran a different store location in the 4th quarter. An assistant manager's cousin. The cousin would write down credit card info from the receipts and then buy items by having high school girls come in to buy items with him punching the stolen info. He then meets them after their shift and sells the items for cash at the music retail chain store that would buy and resell the items. This fueled his habit. He was caught when an FBI agent noticed they had been charged for a PlayStation 2 at a location after coming in. He was blonde and blue-eyed, and she didn't want to press charges and ruin his life, so she let him just apologize and the parents paid her back. I can't tell you how many people he robbed this way. The corporation didn't want me to find out and open up a can of worms. They just let me quit and no one was reprimanded. Story 2. I knew this guy back in the early 80s. Let's call him Jim. Well, he really wanted this high-powered superbike, but he knew he could never afford it. So what he did was to take a drive to London and scout it about a few days until he found a particular model parked outside a house. He goes back that night with a side hammer, pulls the lock, and steals the bike. He gets it home, puts it in his garage, and completely strips it so that the only thing left is the frame and the bottom half of the engine, which he drags into the weeds at the bottom of his garden. Then he pours fuel over it and it burns a bit. A few weeks pass and weeds have started growing over it. It's at that point he calls the cops and reports that someone had dumped a bike frame in his garden. The cops show up and he explains that he'd just gotten back from being away and found it. The cops take the frame and note down his name and address. A few years later, the cops call him and say the bike had been stolen from London a month or so ago from the serial number on the bottom half of the engine frame, and that the insurance company had classed the bike as a write-off and had told the cops to dispose of it. Now, because the frame was found in his garden and the insurance company didn't want it, the cops were duty-bound to ask him if he wanted to keep it, or if they should throw it. So he tells them that he's always wanted to build a bike. So he gets the frame back from them, repaints it, then puts it all back together, and re-registered it as a Q-Reg, stolen and recovered. I forgot to call him Jim, didn't I? You might be asking if I'm Jim. No, I'm not. Story 3. I'm not a cop, but close to 20 years ago, a guy on Australia's Gold Coast got away with a bank robbery in broad daylight. He cased the bank for a while and discovered a pattern of the bank manager arriving about 30 minutes before anyone else each morning, where he would leave the front doors unlocked so staff could help themselves in without a key or needing to wait for the boss to come in and let them in. One morning, the crook dressed himself up for a busy day of office work and waited for the bank manager to arrive. As the manager was unlocking the doors, he made his move, entering the building and threatening the manager with a gun. He got all the details he'd need to access the vault, tied up the manager, and stuffed him in his office. When the staff arrived, he told them that the manager had called in sick and that the regional office had sent him in to do the open shop thing, and no one batted an eyelid. This bank had a small walk-in vault that normally only held about 30 to 50K on any given day. But an old maid had timed his robbery on the morning after a business banking day when all the local small businesses would make their end-of-the-week deposits, and reportedly got a score of close to 250K. Once the vault was open, he pulled his gun out and invited all the staff to enter the vault and lock them in. By this stage, the bank was due to be open, so when he went to leave, several customers were waiting to get inside to do their banking. He told them all that there had been an issue with the computers, and that the tech team had estimated it would take about 30 minutes before the issue would be resolved, and that they couldn't open until then. Then he got into his car and drove straight to the airport and flew to Hong Kong, and then disappeared. To my knowledge, the cops never caught him and never managed to find the money. They knew he'd have had to leave most of it in Australia somewhere, because you can only take 10K Australian dollars in cash in any currency out of the country before customs calls you into their interview rooms. So the assumption was that he had to have an accomplice here who would funnel the money to him slowly over time. For those wondering, he was identified later after a witness statement and CCTV led to his getaway car being discovered at the airport, where he boarded a plane destined for Hong Kong, which is as far as they could track him. Story 4. Not a police officer, but was a resident advisor in college. My university owned all the houses adjacent to campus. They were run like dorms, with RAs, resident advisors, and the same rules, which included a very strict no alcohol policy. It was a privilege to live in the houses, and priority was given to the upperclassmen, who were more likely to bend that rule because they were of age, and it was harder to police off-campus in houses. There was a student who went around knocking on doors saying something like, "I'm a resident advisor and Mr. Roberts sent me for health and wellness checks." She'd find their booze, take it, and follow up with how she's doing them a favor by just giving them a warning. She was not actually an RA, and was just keeping the booze for herself. The only reason she got found out was because she did it to an actual resident advisor. The RA was male. They kept men and women housing separate, and just assumed he didn't know her because of that. It was only later that he questioned why they had a female doing wellness checks on male housing. They did an investigation and asked other residents. The incidents dated back to previous 2 years. They never found out who it was. Story 5. Probably someone who committed a crime I never solved. With that being said, I had a guy use a sledgehammer to smash his way through a wall at Best Buy and steal a bunch of phones and cameras. He was smart enough to wear gloves and a face mask and not touch anything he didn't have to. Alarms didn't go off until he exited out of the back door, which the alarm company gets after a minute or two and takes them like 3/4 minutes to call us, giving him a good 5-minute head start, so he was probably a few miles away before we got dispatched to it. He clearly scoped out the area before doing his deed too. Smart dude. so part of the building was built into a hill. So the hole was on the backside of the building along the grade line. But when you're inside the building, it was about 8 feet up, so it was easier for him to leave out a door. Also, the wall section where he broke through was a hollow cement block, and the portion of the wall below was poured concrete. Story 6. A guy, let's call him Dave, I worked with told this story. He was working at a Mercedes dealership. He was sitting at a desk when this well-dressed gentleman came in and asked if he could test drive a specific car that was parked out front. It was also a busy day. Usually, they are allowed to let people test drive by themselves after they had taken some form of a deposit or something. Maybe the official ID or something. Not really relevant. So Dave gives out the keys, and the guy goes on his test drive and comes back a reasonable amount of time later. He walks in and hands off the key and gets his deposit whatever back. This was about closing time, even possibly on a Friday. Everything is in order. Fast forward to the next business day. Dave's boss walks in and realizes that one of the Mercedes out front is gone. Dave has to explain that the car was returned and that they have the key and everything. Turns out the criminal didn't test drive. He drove somewhere to create a replica of the key and gave that replica back to the desk. He kept the real key. That smart son of a bitch. Story 7. I'm not a cop, but I know an incident in Fargo, North Dakota, where a guy wanted to steal electronic equipment. The store had plenty of alarms on it, and generally cutting an alarm triggers an alarm, so instead he cut all the alarms. This was before cell phones were really widespread, and alarms were usually just connected to the phone line. He found an access point to one of the phone company's big truck lines. Correction, 9 access points. Massive thick copper cables with tens of thousands of lines running through them. He cut through the whole thing with a circular saw, knocked out phone service to most of the town, and robbed an audio store during the ensuing chaos. There were no leads up until a tip came from another town where he'd pulled something similar. They hadn't been able to pin that on him, but had strong suspicions, and he'd relocated to Fargo. So the cops visit him. He refused to let them in because they didn't have a warrant, so the cops left to get one without leaving anyone to watch him, and he split. When they came back, they found the saw coated in copper dust and a lot of stolen stuff. He was in the wind for a while, but even after he got caught, he had another card to play. While being transported between prisons, he used a key he'd made to unlock his shackles and climb out of the roof. Story 8. I used to work at a Chase bank. At the time, upper management demanded that we bankers work the lobby, meaning we would grab people from the teller line and help them do their transactions. But it was just an excuse to try and get new accounts, credit cards, etc. This particular day, it's midday and it is super busy, and one of the female bankers got up to grab somebody from the line. She asks the man if he needs help and he responds in Spanish. He says that he is okay with waiting, but she insists that he comes with her, so he follows. He sat down at her desk and handed her his note that said he had a bomb and that he was robbing the place. She looked at him and said, "Oh, you got to get in line for this." The guy did exactly as she told him. She went and told the manager on the teller side what was going on. He called the man over and opened up a window specifically for him. She went to the bathroom to hyperventilate. The manager proceeded to give the bank robber somewhere in the neighborhood $10,000. The guy left and ran a few blocks down where we assumed the getaway car was. Nobody knew what was going on. The phone started ringing and I picked it up. "This is Chase Corporate Security. We just received an alarm from your branch. Is everything okay?" Haha, okay, that's funny. You got me. Who is this? Just then, I look up and start seeing a lot of commotion. A manager is locking doors. People are shuffling around quickly. You know what? I think something did happen. I put them on hold and asked the manager, and he confirmed we were robbed. He then took the call. A week later, a similar situation happened at a bank down the street. This was just as they were opening. They had a different type of entrance. Double doors on the main street, a foyer, and double doors in the branch. The robber goes into the main street entrance, walks through the foyer, and realizes the doors to enter the branch were locked. He knocks, someone walks over, and he slips them the note, again stating that he has a bomb. The employee read the note and was able to lock the street entrance from the inside, effectively locking this dude in the foyer. The employees all hustle out the back. The cops are called and he's arrested without incident. He isn't the same guy who robbed us, but the MO, or modus operandi, is the same. Spanish speaking with a perfectly crafted note in English. So the cops asked him where he got the note, and he said that some guy picked him up at a labor site and told him that he would make $1,000 just for dropping off this note. Then, because he didn't speak English, he didn't know what the note said. I don't know if they ever hit another bank or if they were ever caught, but that has always stuck out to me as one of the smartest crimes. They're picking up somebody who is completely unassuming and who doesn't know them whatsoever. They're giving him vague instructions with a note that he cannot understand, and I'm sure once the transaction is complete, they are dropping him off at the labor site and move on with their lives. Story 9. Not a copper, but this was pretty smart. I used to run bars at several venues around the north of England, one of which was Chester Racecourse. Usually we just have to keep an eye out for scousers trying to nick drinks or sneak in without paying. And with it being so close to Liverpool, there was a fair amount of security on site. You could tell them as they'd be suited, booted, a high-vis waistcoat on, and usually carrying a radio. Now there were dozens or so of bars dotted around the course, and you can imagine the amount of money that was taken from 100,000 or so punters drinking steadily from 11 until 8 or 9 in the evening. So every hour or so, the security would go around the bars in turn and take all the high denomination notes from each till and stick them in a safe in the main building. So I stood there one day, pulling pints, doing the same barman thing. The security blokes have been around a few times and it's getting steadily busier. Then one bloke shows up on his own, hi-fi on and radio in his hand, does the till, leaving the usual receipt so he can balance up at the end of the meeting. Bit early, I think, but hey-ho, I've got plenty to do. Then 10 minutes or so later, 2 more blokes show up, dressed the same. Oh, your mate's just been here, I said. No need to touch that just yet. What mate? We're the only 2 doing this duty today. Cue a rapid-fire and increasingly panicked exchange over the radio. The matey boy who'd done the till before used to work there apparently. So he knew the drill and he'd been watching the guards and knew just when to time in and what order they were going round the bars in. Apparently he got 9 or 10 before he decided not to push his luck any further and walked away with about 80 grand. They were a bit stricter on the procedure after that. Story 10. I worked with this one guy who had a lengthy record. He had a system for getting released if he got caught. After committing a crime, if the police were in pursuit and he knew he was about to be cornered, he would act insane. His girl would play along with it, telling the police that he was off his medication. The police would arrest him, but then send him to a mental ward with papers instructing the ward to release him to the police once he was cleared. Once he was in the mental ward, he would cause a distraction that would make the person attending the desk with the file cabinet leave the said cabinet. He would then crawl to the file cabinet, look for his release to police papers, and then would literally eat the papers. When the psych evaluators decided that he was stable enough to be released, there would be no instructions to send him to the police, and he would be released to the general public. He did this about 10 times until police officers noticed him back on the streets. This stunt forced the state to change its procedure for detaining mentally unstable suspects. Story 11. One guy would print barcodes, bring them into Home Depot, and stick them on merchandise in the $100 range. When scanned, the items came up around the $10 range. Putting random barcodes on things isn't really illegal and super hard to notice. Guy 2 would come in an hour later and buy the underpriced stuff. Complete plausible deniability. They would then sell the stuff on eBay. The only reason they got caught is that the guy with the barcode printer software cut the second guy out of the operation. So Guy 2 stole a bunch of barcodes, put them on the merchandise, and paid for it immediately afterward. Then he proceeded to rat on the first guy and spilled the beans that they'd been doing this every week for over 4 years. Because we could only pin one case on him, the burglary was dropped down to petty theft, and he walked away with a few days in the county and a small fine. Dude probably took Home Depot for tens of thousands over the years. Story 12. Having worked as a disciplinary officer in corrections, I've always been amazed at the ingenuity of inmates. The problem most run into is the follow-up of crime they commit. Our department received a call one night that there were 3 of our inmates walking down a street a short distance away from jail. The 3 were caught quickly. They were still wearing their stripes. However, upon doing a roster check, it was discovered that there was still one missing. He was caught about a month later. So the ingenuity was more in how they escaped. They were housed in one of our maximum security tiers. After lockdown, there is really only one way out of the cell. There is a very narrow window in each cell overlooking the yard. This was never really seen as a viable escape risk, as they were so narrow, one would have to be really skinny to even attempt to try to squeeze through. Due to lack of staffing, our guard tower stayed unmanned, so they took note of that. They spent a year losing weight and observing the officers that worked the tier, taking note of which ones were lax in their duties. They loosened one of the windows, and when they finally reached a weight where they could all fit through, they took their opportunity. The officer on duty that night was so lax he didn't notice that 4 men entered a 2-man cell at lockdown. Not just that, he didn't do a roster check during lockdown, so they got out and used a mattress to climb over the razor wire. The problem is that they didn't have a good strategy after they escaped. The one that was out the longest was probably the smartest, as he decided to part ways with the 3, who felt like it was a good idea to walk on a street in their prison stripes, but he had no real plan either. He spent his time living in people's fishing camps when they weren't around. He was caught when one of the campers surprised him and called the department, who was able to locate him shortly after.